The letter had been so cold and practical that Letitia Bailey had read it 4 times on the train, searching for some warmth between the lines, and found absolutely none. She sat in the swaying passenger car with the paper smoothed across her lap, watching the Kansas plains roll past the window in great waves of amber grass and pale sky. And she told herself this was what she deserved for being 23 years old and nearly destitute in the year 1878. She had answered the advertisement herself. She had written her own name at the bottom of the reply letter in her neatest hand. Nobody had forced her into this. And yet, as the train clattered westward toward the town of Harlan Creek, she felt very much like a woman being carried somewhere against her better judgment. The advertisement had been simple. A farmer in western Kansas, age 31, sought a wife of good character and capable disposition. Must be willing to work. The letter that followed her reply had been written by a man named Albert Hawkins, and it had told her the practical things. The size of the farm, which was 160 acres of homestead land he had proved up on 3 years prior, the number of rooms in the house, which was 4, and the nearest town, which was 6 miles east. He had told her he kept cattle and a kitchen garden and 2 horses. He had told her there was a church in Harlan Creek that held services every Sunday and a dry goods store that received shipments from Wichita twice a month. He had not told her whether he was kind. He had not told her whether he was lonely. He had not told her anything at all that might have made her feel less like a transaction being conducted across several hundred miles of open prairie. She folded the letter and tucked it back into her coat pocket and looked out the window again. She had grown up in Cincinnati, in a narrow house that always smelled faintly of the tannery 2 streets over. Her father had died when she was 15, leaving behind debts that her mother had spent the next 5 years quietly paying. Her mother had died the previous spring, and the debts had passed to Letitia, along with the furniture and a small tin box containing $11.40. The house had been sold by the bank before summer was out. She had spent 6 months working as a seamstress for a dress shop on Vine Street, sharing a boarding house room with 2 other women. And then the shop had closed, and the winter had come, and the $11 were long gone, and she had sat down one gray November morning and written her name at the bottom of a reply to a stranger's advertisement. She had expected nothing from it. That was the truth she kept returning to as the train slowed, and the conductor called out Harlan Creek in a voice like gravel rolling in a tin can. She had expected a man who needed a housekeeper and was willing to call it a marriage. She had expected hard winters and lonely evenings, and a life that was functional but largely empty of the things she had once, foolishly, hoped for. She had not expected anything good. She had simply expected to survive. The platform at Harlan Creek was a single weathered plank of raised timber, and when Letitia stepped down from the train with her single trunk and her small carpet bag, the wind hit her like a flat, open hand. It was early March, and the prairie did not trouble itself with the kind of polite cold that Cincinnati offered. This cold was honest and enormous. It came from every direction at once. She stood on the platform and looked around. There was a main street visible from where she stood, not long, maybe 2 blocks, with a handful of storefronts. There was a water tower. There was red dust collecting in the corners of the platform boards despite the cold. And there was a man standing at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning the brim through his fingers in a slow circle, watching her with an expression she could not quite read from this distance. She picked up her carpetbag and walked toward him because there was no one else on the platform, and because she supposed that was what you did. He was tall. She noticed that first, taller than she had pictured from the letter, which was an absurd thing to notice given that the letter had said nothing about his height. He had brown hair that was a little long under his hat brim and dark eyes, and a face that was weathered in the way that outdoor work makes a face weathered, with lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting at sun and distance. He was wearing clean clothes. She noticed that too. His shirt was clean and his coat was brushed, and he had clearly made some effort which struck her as unexpectedly touching before she could stop herself from being touched by it. He put his hat back on when she was a few feet away. "Miss Bailey," he said. His voice was even and quiet, the kind of voice that did not make itself big by shouting but that you nonetheless heard clearly. "Mr. Hawkins," she said. They looked at each other for a moment in the way that two people who are complete strangers and are somehow also about to get married look at each other, which is to say, with a great deal of careful neutrality. "The pastor is available this afternoon," he said. "If you're willing, or we can wait if you need time to rest from the journey." She had been on a train for a day and a half. She was tired and her back ached, and she was wearing the better of her two dresses, the gray wool one, which she had pressed carefully before leaving Cincinnati. She looked at him and he looked at her, and she said, "This afternoon is fine." He nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he had already prepared for, and he picked up her trunk without being asked, and carried it to a wagon hitched at the edge of the platform. He lifted it into the wagon bed as if it weighed nothing, which made her feel briefly self-conscious about everything she had packed, and then he offered her his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. His hand was very warm and calloused, and he released hers the moment she was settled. The pastor's name was Reverend Aldous Cole, and he had a small white church on the east end of the main street with a stove in the back that kept it warm enough for the ceremony. There was a woman named Mrs. Hargrove who owned the general store and who served as witness, and she had brought a small clutch of dried flowers that she pressed into Letitia's hands before the ceremony with a warm smile that Letitia found herself grateful for. The ceremony was brief. Letitia said the words because they were the words, and she felt the gold band simple, plain slide onto her finger, and then she was married to Albert Hawkins, a man she had known for approximately 45 minutes. He drove her out to the farm as the sun began to lower itself toward the western horizon in shades of orange and gold that she had to admit were extraordinary. She had not expected the sky to be so enormous. In Cincinnati, the sky was something you saw in strips between rooftops. Here it was everything. It went on and on and on in all directions, and the colors that it turned in the late afternoon were the kind of colors she had only ever seen in paintings. "It does that most evenings," Albert said, and she realized she had turned toward the west with an expression that had probably been somewhat undignified in its openness. "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant it, and she was annoyed at herself for meaning it because she had come here determined not to be charmed. The farm appeared as a collection of shapes in the dimming light, a barn and a house, and a fence line running back toward a stand of cottonwood trees that had gone silver in the fading afternoon. The house was small but solid, built of timber and sod with a proper roof, and there was a light in the front window, which meant Albert had left a lamp burning before he went to fetch her, which meant he had thought about her coming home to a dark house and had not wanted that for her. She got down from the wagon before he could offer his hand this time, and she walked to the front door and pushed it open. The house was warm. He had banked the stove before he left, and it had held, so the 4 rooms were properly warm against the night that was settling in outside. The kitchen was clean. The main room had a table and 2 chairs and a braided rug that someone had made by hand. The bedroom had a proper iron bedstead with a quilt that looked homemade, in a log cabin pattern with squares of blue and white and yellow. And on the windowsill of the main room, in a row along the inside ledge where the last of the light through the glass could find them, there were pressed wildflowers. She stopped. They were dried and pressed flat, the kind of thing you press between the pages of a heavy book and then set out carefully, and there were perhaps a dozen of them in a line along the wooden sill. Prairie coneflowers, she thought, and something yellow she did not immediately recognize, and what might have been a prairie aster, its petals spread and pale as paper. He had pressed wildflowers into the windowsill before she came. She stood looking at them for a long moment, and she did not speak, because she did not trust herself to speak in a measured way. She had told herself this would be a practical arrangement. She had told herself she would not expect warmth and therefore not be disappointed by its absence. But here were pressed wildflowers on the windowsill, placed there by a man she had never met, for a woman he had never met, because he wanted the place to be something other than cold when she arrived. She heard him come in behind her with her trunk, setting it down in the bedroom doorway. "My mother used to keep dried flowers," he said, and his voice was careful, as if he was explaining something he was a little embarrassed by. "I thought it might make it feel less like a strange place." She turned around and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, and he was watching her with those dark, quiet eyes, and he was clearly bracing himself for some reaction he hadn't yet determined would be positive or negative. "Thank you," she said, and she meant that too. He made coffee that first evening and they sat at the kitchen table, and he told her about the farm in a more personal way than the letter had managed. About how he had come out from Missouri 6 years ago with 3 other men who had all eventually given up and gone back east or moved on to Colorado, and how he had stayed because, by the time the others left, he had already put too much of himself into the ground to walk away from it. He told her about the cattle, 12 head, and about the horses, a bay named Copperhead and a gray named Margaret, and about the kitchen garden, which he said he had never been particularly skilled with but which grew potatoes and beans well enough. She told him about Cincinnati and the seamstress work and a little about her mother, not the hard parts but the shape of it. He listened without interrupting, which she noticed. They were careful with each other. They were formal and careful, and she thought that was right for now, that they were 2 strangers in a house, and the polite thing to do was to give each other room. He slept in the main room that first night, a fact he had communicated before she even had to wonder about it, spreading his bedroll on the floor by the stove without any drama about it, just matter-of-factly making up his bed out there and telling her the bedroom was hers. She lay in the iron bedstead under the log cabin quilt and listened to the wind move across the roof and the creak of the house settling, and she thought about the wildflowers on the windowsill and felt something shift very slightly in the fixed and practical arrangement she had built inside herself. The first week was a study in the textures of someone else's daily life. She woke early and found that Albert was already up, already out to feed the cattle and check the horses, and that he had put the coffee on before going out so that she would have it waiting. She was not sure what to make of this. She began to make breakfast before he came in, which seemed like the obvious exchange, and the first morning she set a plate of salt pork and cornbread on the table, and he came in from the cold with his coat dusted with frost and stopped in the doorway with an expression that was briefly and thoroughly surprised before he smoothed it back into something quieter. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she said. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She began to understand the rhythms of the farm over those first days. She understood that the cattle were his priority and the kitchen garden was something he tended, but without great optimism, and that the house had been clean but had the particular emptiness of a place where a person had been living alone for a long time without anyone to share it with. She began to fill it in small ways. She mended a curtain that had come loose from its rod. She found a cache of canning jars in the cellar and sorted them. She took inventory of the dry goods in the kitchen and made a list of what was needed, and when Albert was driving into Harlan Creek at the end of the first week, she handed him the list and he looked at it for a moment and then at her. "I didn't know we were out of nutmeg," he said. "You had a quarter of a tin," she said. "That's nearly out." He looked at the list again. "I'll get it all," he said. He came back with everything on the list plus a bolt of blue calico that he set on the kitchen table without comment, and then went back out to the barn. She stood looking at the calico for a minute, at the small blue flowers printed on the pale background, and then she folded it carefully and put it on the shelf in the bedroom where she kept her sewing things. The spring came in a rush after that first week, the way Kansas spring does, arriving not gradually but all at once, with warmth and wind and the greening of the grass from brown to the most vivid, improbable green. The prairie transformed. She had not been prepared for how beautiful the transformation would be. She stood at the kitchen window one morning in late March and watched the light move across the grass in great traveling shadows from the clouds overhead, and she thought that she understood now why Albert had not been able to leave. She had begun to learn him in the small ways that you learn a person you live closely with. She learned that he was quiet in the mornings until his second cup of coffee, not because he was unpleasant, but because he was genuinely not fully present until then. She learned that he read in the evenings, history mostly and occasionally novels, and that his reading lamp cast a warm light across his face that made him look less weathered and more like himself, whoever that was. She was working to find out. She learned that he whistled while he worked in the barn, the same 3 or 4 songs cycling through in no particular order, and that she could hear it faintly through the kitchen wall on still mornings, and that it was a strangely comfortable sound. She learned that he had a neighbor, a man named Cyrus Drum, who farmed 3 miles to the north, and that Cyrus came around occasionally on a brown horse named Tuesday and leaned on the fence and talked to Albert about cattle prices, and whether in the way that men who see each other rarely but reliably tend to talk, with a compressed casualness that held a lot of genuine regard underneath it. The first time Cyrus came after she arrived, he took his hat off when he saw her and said, "Mrs. Hawkins," with such easy warmth that she felt the unfamiliarity of the her name now settle a little more comfortably on her shoulders. "Mr. Drum," she said, and Cyrus looked at Albert with an expression that communicated something in that shorthand way that old friends communicate things without speaking, and Albert looked at the fence post. The town of Harlan Creek was small but not unfriendly. The second Sunday after she arrived, she accompanied Albert to the church service, wearing her gray wool dress, which she had added a collar of white cotton to, made from a scrap she had found in her sewing bag. The church was half full, maybe 30 people, and Mrs. Hargrove from the general store was there and nodded warmly, and Reverend Cole preached for about 40 minutes on the subject of patience, which Letitia found appropriate under the circumstances. After the service, there was the kind of informal gathering on the church steps that small towns produce, and she was introduced to the sheriff, a steady man named George Platt who had a gray mustache and an honest handshake. She met the school teacher, a young woman named Dora Finch, who was perhaps 20 and had the bright, determined look of someone who had come west deliberately rather than by necessity. She met a rancher named Holt McRee and his wife Clara, who had 3 children under the age of 6, and who pressed Letitia's hand between both of hers and said, "We are so glad he finally found someone. He has been out there alone too long." She said it with such genuine warmth that Letitia didn't know where to look. On the drive home, she sat next to Albert on the wagon seat with the spring wind pulling at the ribbon of her hat, and she said, "Clara McRee says you've been alone too long." He drove for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Clara McRee says a lot of things. Is she wrong?" Another pause. The horse's hooves thudded steadily on the dry road. "No," he said. "She's generally not wrong about much." It was the most he had offered about himself, about the inside of things, and she received it quietly and did not press. April brought the kitchen garden into serious conversation. Albert had turned the soil in late March and she had been looking at it from the kitchen window, thinking about what the ground might accept. She had learned to garden as a girl, her mother keeping a small plot behind their Cincinnati house, and she had something to offer here. One afternoon she went out while Albert was mending fence on the east side of the property, and she knelt in the turned earth and worked a section of it more finely between her hands, testing the texture. She did not hear him come back until his shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find him standing there, watching her with his hand resting on the fence post behind him. "I was thinking about the layout," she said, brushing her palms together. "If you put the beans here, they can trail along this section of fence, and it'll save you from building supports. And if the tomatoes go here, they'll get the afternoon sun." He crouched down beside her, which put him close enough that she could see the particular shade of his eyes clearly, which were not simply brown but were a deep, warm brown with something golden in them which she had not noticed before. He looked at the garden plot in the way he looked at everything, carefully and without hurry. "I've been putting the tomatoes on the north end," he said. "They've not done well there." "They've done adequately." "Adequately," she repeated. "They could probably do better," he said, and there was something in the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. She reorganized the kitchen garden over the next 2 weeks, and he did not interfere, but he helped when she needed an extra set of hands, crouching beside her in the dirt without complaint, and following her direction with a straightforwardness that she appreciated. There was an afternoon when they were both kneeling over a section of soil, their hands both working in the same patch of earth, and her fingers brushed his accidentally, and neither of them spoke about it, but she was aware of it for the rest of the afternoon in a way that was confusing and not unpleasant. She had been at the farm for 6 weeks when the thing shifted that she had known was going to have to shift eventually. It happened on a Wednesday evening in April. She had made a proper supper, salt pork and the last of the winter potatoes, and some dried apple that she had sweetened with a little sugar, and they had eaten, and she had cleared the plates, and he had gone to his reading in the main room as was his custom. But tonight she poured 2 cups of coffee instead of one, and carried them both to the main room table, and set one in front of him, and kept one for herself and sat across the table from him. He looked up from his book. "I want to understand something," she said, and she said it straightforwardly because she had thought about it for the past several days and she did not want to be indirect. "When you wrote the advertisement, what were you looking for?" He held the book open in his lap for a moment, and then he closed it and set it on the table, which she understood to mean he was going to give the question his full attention. "A partner," he said, "a practical one." "Yes," he said, and then, and perhaps more than that, but I didn't think it was fair to put more than that in an advertisement addressed to a stranger. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I came here expecting a very spare life," she said. "I want you to know that. I had made peace with that." "I know," he said. "I could see it in how you held yourself on the platform. Like you were ready to endure something." That stopped her. "I didn't think it was that obvious." "It wasn't unkind," he said. "It was sensible. You were being sensible." He paused. "I didn't want to be merely endured," he said, and his voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was careful and exposed. "I put the flowers on the windowsill because I wanted—" He stopped. "Because you wanted what?" "Because I wanted the house to feel like somewhere you might want to be," he said, "rather than somewhere you had agreed to stay." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and thought that this man, this quiet, careful man who had put wildflowers on her windowsill before he had ever seen her face, was perhaps the most unexpectedly tender person she had encountered in her entire adult life, and that she had very nearly missed it because she had arrived with her heart so carefully defended. "It worked," she said quietly. "The flowers worked." Something in his face changed then, something eased. He picked up his coffee cup, and she picked up hers, and they sat in the lamplight with the April wind moving around the outside of the house, and the stove ticking its warmth into the room, and the silence between them was entirely different from the careful, formal silence of the first week. It was warm. It was the silence of 2 people who have found something in each other and are sitting with the knowledge of it. He moved his bedroll to the main room that night, but the following Sunday he asked her very quietly, very carefully, whether she wanted him to continue to sleep there, or whether she was comfortable with him returning to the bedroom, and she told him honestly that she would like him to come back to the bedroom, and that was that. May came and the prairie exploded. She had not had the vocabulary for it until she lived inside it. The wildflowers came up everywhere, as if the earth had been storing them under its brown winter coat, and had now simply opened everything up at once. There were purple and yellow and white flowers in the grass around the house and along the creek line, and she cut some of them and put them in a jam jar of water on the kitchen windowsill, and Albert came in from the barn and stopped and looked at them and then looked at her. "Now you're doing it," he said. "Doing what?" "The flowers on the windowsill." She felt her face warm in a way that she could not entirely account for, and she turned back to the stove. But she heard him settle into his chair at the kitchen table with a kind of satisfaction. They had begun to talk in the evenings in a way that was genuinely enjoyable, not the careful exchange of practical information but actual conversation. She had discovered that he was interested in many things she was also interested in: history and the mechanics of things, and the question of what was happening in the eastern states with the politics of Reconstruction, about which he had thoughtful and well-reasoned opinions that he stated clearly without aggression. She had not expected this. She had thought, in her uncharitable pre-arrival imagining, that a Kansas farmer would be limited in his intellectual range, and she felt genuinely ashamed of this assumption when faced with the reality of him. She told him so one evening, and he looked at her with that almost smile and said, "I thought a city seamstress would be impatient with farm work." And she laughed, and it was the first real laugh she had produced since arriving, and it surprised both of them with its fullness. The trouble with the cattle came in late May. Albert had 12 head when she arrived, and he had been planning to expand the herd in the summer. But in the last week of May, he went out one morning and found 2 of the cows sick with what he recognized as Texas fever, brought by the tick that traveled up with the longhorn drives from the south. He was out most of that day, and she kept his coffee hot and watched through the window, and when he came in the late afternoon, he sat down at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his jaw set. "I may lose several of them," he said. "The fever spreads fast." "What can be done?" she said. "Separate the sick ones," he said. "Keep them away from the healthy cattle. It's already spread to at least one more, I think. What about the rest of the herd?" "Wait and see," he said, and she could see what that kind of waiting cost a man who had been building his herd slowly and carefully over 6 years. She did not offer false comfort. She sat down across from him and said, "All right. What do you need me to do?" He looked at her. "To help," she said. "What can I do to help?" He told her, and she did it. She helped him move feed. She kept the water troughs clean to prevent further tick contact. She kept track of which animals were showing symptoms and reported to him accurately each morning on what she had observed. She was not a rancher, and she knew she was not a rancher, but she was organized and observant and capable. And over the following 2 weeks, as the fever ran its course, she felt them working together as a unit in a way that was new and solid and good. They lost 3 cattle. It was a serious loss, and Albert absorbed it with a quietness that she recognized as grief of a particular kind, the grief of work that has come to nothing, which is its own category. The evening after the last of the 3 died, he sat on the porch steps in the dark, and she brought 2 cups of coffee out and sat beside him on the step without saying anything. The sky was enormous and black and full of stars in a way that still occasionally stunned her. The Milky Way was visible as a pale river overhead. In Cincinnati, you never saw the Milky Way. "I can rebuild it," he said after a while. It was not despair. It was just a statement of fact. "I know you can," she said. He turned and looked at her in the dark, and she turned and looked at him, and they were sitting very close on the narrow step, and she was aware of his warmth against the cool of the night air. "Letitia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and the way he said it was like something he had been saving up. "Albert," she said back, and she meant it like an answer. He kissed her then, quietly and without hurry, one hand coming up to her jaw in a gesture so careful it made her eyes sting. She kissed him back, and above them the Milky Way crossed the enormous dark sky, and the Kansas night smelled of grass and cattle and the particular clean cold of open air. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment. "I was afraid you might leave," he said, "once you saw what the life actually was." "I'm not leaving," she said. "I know that now," he said. "I think I knew it when you came out into the rain to help move the sick cattle and didn't complain once." "I was complaining internally," she said. He laughed. It was a quiet, warm laugh that she felt in her chest. She decided she would spend as much time as possible making him produce that laugh. June settled on them like a gift. The kitchen garden she had redesigned was coming up beautifully, the beans running along the fence line just as she had planned, the tomatoes in their southern bed putting out blossoms. She stood over the garden in the mornings and felt a satisfaction that was partly the satisfaction of growing things, and partly the satisfaction of having been right about the tomatoes. Albert rode out to Harlan Creek one Thursday and came back with a letter for her from a woman named Ruth Pickering in Cincinnati, a friend from the dress shop days who had stayed at the boarding house. Ruth's letter was cheerful and full of gossip about people Letitia barely missed, and it ended with, "I do hope the farmer is not too dreadful." Letitia sat at the kitchen table and wrote back, "He is not dreadful at all. He is, in fact, one of the best men I have ever known." She sealed the letter and set it aside to give Albert for the next trip to town, and she sat for a moment after writing those words, testing them for truth, and found them entirely true. Cyrus Drum came around in mid-June with news from the county seat, which was a thing he did periodically, because Cyrus had a network of acquaintances across the county that functioned like a kind of informal telegraph. The news this time was that there had been some trouble 20 miles south, a dispute between a rancher named Delbert Foss and a family of farmers who had put up fence across land that Foss had been using as open range. Foss was a large cattle operation man who had been in the county before the homesteaders came, and he had not reconciled himself to the new reality of the Homestead Act and the farms that came with it. "He's pressuring some of the smaller places," Cyrus said, leaning on the fence and talking to Albert while Letitia brought out coffee because Cyrus always appreciated coffee. "Cutting fences. Let 3 of his hands ride through McNeil's wheat last week." Albert's face went still. "McNeil called the sheriff, called him. Platt's doing what he can, but Foss has money and lawyers." "He's not going to come this far north," Albert said. "Probably not," Cyrus said. "But I'd put up a good fence on your south line if I were you." Albert spent 2 days reinforcing the south fence line after Cyrus's visit, and Letitia understood that this was a real thing and not excessive caution. This was the West, 1878, and land was contested in ways that could turn dangerous. She had understood this in the abstract before coming here, and now she understood it in the specific, grounded way. One afternoon, while Albert was out working on the fence, she heard a rider come into the yard and went to the door. The man on the horse was not anyone she recognized, a rough-looking man in a dirty duster with small eyes and a way of sitting his horse that she did not like. "Hawkins around?" the man said, not getting down. "He's on the property," she said, standing in the doorway. "Who should I say is asking?" "Just tell him someone from Foss's outfit came by," the man said, and turned his horse and rode back south without another word. Her heart was beating rather fast when Albert came in that evening and she told him about it. He listened with his jaw tight, and then he said, "Thank you for telling me. You did exactly right." He sat at the kitchen table for a moment. "Foss is sending riders out to see who can be intimidated," he said. "I'm not going to be intimidated. But I want you to know what's going on." "I appreciate that," she said. "If anyone comes by while I'm out again and you're not comfortable, you have every right to tell them to leave our land," he said. "This is your land too." "Your land too." It was the first time he had said it that way, and it settled into her with a warmth and a weight that were both significant. The rider did not come back. The trouble with Foss remained south of them, and Sheriff Platt eventually brought a formal complaint to the county judge that summer that resulted in Foss being legally restrained from the fence cutting, which was not a perfect resolution but was something. The rule of law in western Kansas in 1878 was imperfect and sometimes slow, but it was there, and men like George Platt were committed to it with a genuine conviction. The summer moved through them richly. The farm was productive and the garden was more than productive. It was genuinely thriving, and Letitia found herself canning with a focused pleasure she had not anticipated. She made pickles and preserved tomatoes and put up jars of dried beans and apple butter from the apples Albert had planted along the east fence line 3 years prior, little gnarled trees that were just coming into their fruit. The cellar filled with jars, and it gave her a feeling of such solid security that she sometimes went down there in the evenings just to look at them. Albert bought 2 new cattle in July from a man 2 counties north who had a clean, tick-free herd, beginning the work of rebuilding what the fever had taken. He told her about it at supper the night before he went to pick them up, laying out the economics of it plainly and including her in the calculation, and she realized this was how he thought of things, as shared. She found it remarkable that a man she had been afraid would be cold and impersonal had turned out to be the most genuinely inclusive person in her life. She told him one evening in August, sitting on the porch in the warm dark after supper, when the fireflies were moving through the grass and the air smelled of the hay he had cut and dried that week. "I was so afraid when I came here," she said. "I want you to know that I was genuinely afraid." He was sitting beside her on the porch bench he had built in June, their shoulders touching in the easy way they had now of touching without ceremony. "I know," he said. "I had decided to expect nothing," she said. "I thought that would protect me from being disappointed. Did it work?" "It backfired dramatically," she said. "You put wildflowers on the windowsill and I was completely unprepared for it." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother gave me that idea," he said. "She used to say that if you want someone to feel at home in a place you have to leave something living in it for them. She kept flowers everywhere. Even in winter she'd find ways to bring something in." He paused. "She died 6 years ago, before I came out here." She turned to look at him. He was looking out at the fireflies in the grass. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Letitia said. "She was," he said. "You would have liked each other." He said it simply, as if he had considered it, as if it was a definite thing. "She would have liked you very much." She took his hand on the porch bench and held it, and the fireflies moved through the grass, and the stars came up over the prairie, and she thought that she had arrived in Kansas expecting to endure her life, and had instead, through some extraordinary miscalculation on the part of the universe, found herself sitting on a porch in the summer dark holding the hand of a man she was in love with. She was in love with him. She had been aware of it building for months, and she had let it build without rushing it, and now in August on the porch with the fireflies she acknowledged it completely. She was in love with Albert Hawkins, with his quiet voice and his careful eyes and the wildflowers on the windowsill, and the way he said her name as if it meant something to him. She did not say it that evening because the evening was already so full that it seemed like too much to add. But she said it 2 days later in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, while he was at the table drinking his first cup of coffee and not entirely present yet, because she decided she would rather say it in an ordinary moment than in a constructed one. "I love you," she said. He looked up from his coffee. "I wanted you to know," she said. "I love you." He set the coffee cup down and stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen to where she was standing by the stove, and he put his hands on either side of her face and he said, "I have been in love with you since the day I watched you reorganize my kitchen garden and tell me I was doing the tomatoes wrong." And then he kissed her in the way that people kiss each other when they have been building toward it for months and are finally letting all of it go. The fall was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She had not known what the prairie did in autumn. She had not known about the gold of the grass, or the particular slant of October light, or the way the cottonwood trees along the creek turned the color of new coins. She walked with Albert in the evenings along the creek line, and they talked about everything, about what they wanted for the farm and what they wanted from their lives, and she told him she would like to plant a real flower garden in the spring. Not just the pressed wildflowers on the windowsill, but an actual garden with color, and he said he would build her whatever borders she wanted. She told him in October that she was going to have a child. They were in the kitchen in the early morning before he had his second coffee, which meant he was not fully present, and she said, "I believe we are going to need a 5th room," and he looked at her and blinked, and then he was very thoroughly present. "Are you certain?" he said. "Reasonably certain," she said. "The doctor in Harlan Creek can confirm it when we go next week, but I am reasonably certain." He was out of his chair before she had finished the sentence, and he had his arms around her in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window, and she could feel him breathing, deep and slow and full, the way a person breathes when they are trying to contain something that is too large for the ordinary size of them. "A baby," he said, against the top of her head. "In the spring, I think," she said. "Around April, if my counting is right." Dr. Varner in Harlan Creek confirmed it the following week. Early April was indeed the estimate. Dr. Varner was a practical, comfortable man who had seen a great many frontier pregnancies, and who told Letitia that she was healthy and that there was every reason for optimism, and she believed him. Albert started on the 5th room in November. He had a natural competence with building, as with most things he turned his hands to, and he worked on it in the shorter days of late fall and early winter, framing it out on the east side of the house. Cyrus Drum came over one Saturday and helped him raise the walls, and they worked all day in the cold with their breath smoking, and Letitia brought coffee and cornbread at midday and listened to them argue in an affectionate way about the best angle for the window. "South-facing," she said when there was a pause. "It will get more light." Both men looked at her. "South-facing," Albert said to Cyrus, as if this had been his opinion all along. Cyrus caught her eye, and she looked away, so he would not see her trying not to smile. The winter settled around them in December, and it was the kind of winter that the prairie offers without apology, hard and cold and relentless, with storms that came in from the north and put snow against the sides of buildings for days at a time. But the house was warm, and the cellar was full, and they had enough firewood and enough food, and they had each other. And Letitia discovered that a hard prairie winter was entirely bearable when you were inside it with the right person. They read together in the evenings more than ever, sometimes aloud, taking turns, and she had sent to Wichita for 2 new books before the worst of winter closed in. One of them, a history of the American frontier that Albert read first and then pressed into her hands with several passages marked, and the other a novel that she read first and then handed to him. And then they talked about both of them at great length over supper for 2 weeks, which was one of the best things about the winter. She wrote to her friend Ruth Pickering a proper letter in December, a long one, telling her about the farm and the garden and the cattle and the new room going up on the east side, and about the baby coming in the spring, and about Albert, about who he actually was, the kind of man who put flowers on a windowsill before a stranger arrived, who said your land too without thinking about it, who listened when you spoke and gave you the south-facing window. She wrote it all down, and she read it back, and she was glad, genuinely and without reservation glad, that she had answered the advertisement. Ruth wrote back in January, her letter arriving on one of the rare clear days when the postal rider made it out to the farms, and the letter said, "I knew that if he had written such a practical and unglamorous advertisement, he was probably a decent man and not one of the flashy kind. I am so relieved, Letitia. I told Mrs. Greer you had landed well, and she did not believe me." Letitia read the letter to Albert that evening, and he looked mildly entertained by the analysis of his advertisement. "Unglamorous," he said. "It really was," she said. "There was nothing in that letter about who you were." "I didn't know how to write that part," he said. "The flowers said it," she said. "The flowers said who you were." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight with the winter pressing against the walls outside, and he said, "You are the best thing that has come from any decision I have ever made." And she felt it all the way through her. January and February were the deep of winter, and they moved through them in the close, comfortable rhythms of the house. She was beginning to show with the baby, and the new room on the east side was plastered and dry, and he had made a cradle, working on it in the evenings by the stove with a patience and care that she found almost unbearable to watch for its tenderness. He was making it for their child, this man who had once been alone in this house for too long and who had pressed wildflowers into the windowsill for a woman he had never met. She told him this one night, watching him sand the side of the cradle. "You did everything right," she said. "Before I came, you made the house warm, and you put the flowers out, and you were honest in your letters, practical but honest, and I was still coming here expecting to endure it. And you did everything right anyway." He set the sandpaper down and looked at her. I didn't know if it would be enough, he said. It was more than enough, she said. Dora Finch, the young schoolteacher, had been coming out to visit on Sundays through the winter, which had started as a practical arrangement when her own boarding situation in town had become temporarily uncertain, and Albert had offered the spare room for the worst of the storms, and which had become a genuine friendship between her and Letitia. Dora was funny and bright, and had strong opinions about education on the frontier that she would deliver at length if given the opportunity, and Letitia enjoyed her company enormously. Dora was 20 and had come from Indiana, and had some of the same quality that Letitia recognized in herself, the quality of having come west armed with practical resolve, and having found, slightly to her bewilderment, that the West was also occasionally beautiful and surprising. Dora had a correspondence with a young man back in Indiana that she spoke about rarely, and with a careful neutrality that suggested she was not sure what she wanted it to become. "Does he want you to go back?" Letitia asked one Sunday afternoon in February when they were sitting by the stove with coffee and Dora had mentioned the correspondence. "He says he does," Dora said. "But he says it in the letters the way you'd say something you've been told to say, not the way you'd say something you felt." "That's an important distinction," Letitia said. "I think so," Dora said. "I think if someone really wanted you, you'd be able to tell." Letitia thought about the flowers on the windowsill. "Yes," she said, "you'd be able to tell." March came and the baby was imminent, and Letitia was enormous and magnificent and entirely finished with winter. Albert was a thorough and attentive caretaker, perhaps more thorough than was strictly necessary, and she had to tell him on more than one occasion that she was pregnant and not made of spun glass, and he would look slightly abashed and then 10 minutes later ask if she needed anything, which she found simultaneously exasperating and deeply sweet. Clara McRee came out in the second week of March to help prepare, because Clara had had 3 children and knew what preparation meant, and she came with her own practical expertise and her genuine warmth, and she spent a day going through the house with Letitia, making sure everything was in order, and Albert stayed out of their way with the obvious relief of a man who recognizes that there are situations in which he is not the most useful person. "He's been a nervous wreck," Clara confided to Letitia, low-voiced, while Albert was out at the barn. "Cyrus says he mentioned the baby at least 4 times the last time they talked, and Cyrus says that is 4 times more than Albert Hawkins has ever discussed personal matters in the 6 years he has known him." Letitia laughed. "He worries," she said. "He worries about you," Clara said. "That is a specific kind of worrying, and it is the best kind." The baby arrived on a Thursday in early April, which was almost exactly the anniversary of the kitchen garden conversation, which pleased her in a superstitious way she would not have admitted to. Dr. Varner came out from town and Clara McRee was there, and it was a hard labor but a good outcome, and when it was over and Dr. Varner put the baby in Albert's arms, Albert stood in the doorway of the new East Room with the south-facing window and the morning light coming in, and he held his son for the first time with an expression that Letitia, who was exhausted and aching and thoroughly satisfied with herself, thought was the most beautiful thing she had seen on a human face. They named him James, after Albert's father, with William as a second name, which had been Letitia's father's name. James William Hawkins. He had dark hair like Albert and a set of lungs that he used enthusiastically, and a way of looking at things that in his first weeks seemed to involve a great deal of serious evaluation, as if he was taking inventory. "He has your way of looking at things," Albert said one evening, watching her nurse the baby. "What way is that?" "Like he's figuring out how everything works," Albert said, "and like he'll have opinions once he does." "You say that like it's a character flaw," she said. "I say it like it's one of my favorite things about you," he said. The spring unrolled around them with the baby and the garden and the cattle, and all the ordinary, extraordinary richness of it. The kitchen garden was even better this year than last, now that the tomatoes were properly sited, and she planted the flower garden Albert had promised to border, with seed packets she had ordered from a merchant in Wichita, hollyhocks and coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, and because she could not resist, sweet peas along the fence. She planted the sweet peas and thought about the pressed wildflowers on the windowsill that were still there. She had left them there all through the year, faded now to the pale brown of old paper but still there, and she thought that she would press some of this year's flowers too and add them to the sill, one for each season they had been here together, a record of a life being built. Albert watched her plant the sweet peas from the barn doorway with the baby against his shoulder, James having developed a tolerance for the barn that Albert was quietly pleased about. "Those will climb the fence," he called to her. "That is the plan," she called back. "I'll build you a proper trellis," he said. "I know you will," she said. Summer was very good. The farm was more productive than the previous year across every measure, the garden and the cattle and the hay, and they were two people who had been doing this together long enough now that the work was well divided and smooth, each of them knowing what the other was doing and covering the gaps without having to discuss it. James was big and healthy and had begun to sit up on his own and to demonstrate the strong opinions that Albert had predicted. Cyrus Drum came by in July with news that he was getting married himself, to a woman named Agnes who had come to stay with her sister in town, and who had, in Cyrus's words, an alarming number of chickens that she intended to bring with her to the farm. He said this with the expression of a man who has decided that the chickens are acceptable collateral. Albert shook his hand and Letitia embraced him, and that Sunday they went to the church to hear Reverend Cole announce the banns, and afterwards at the steps, she watched Cyrus talking to a small, dark-haired woman with a direct gaze who did indeed look like someone who had opinions about chickens. And she thought that Harlan Creek was building itself into a community, slowly, and from the pieces that people brought to it, and that she was glad to be one of those pieces. Dora Finch had made a decision about the young man in Indiana. She had written him a letter, she told Letitia one Sunday afternoon in August, in which she had said that she thought they had come to different conclusions about their futures and that she wished him well. She said it with a kind of relief that was the relief of a decision that was right. "Are you all right?" Letitia asked. "I am very all right," Dora said. "I think I have been meaning to write that letter since February, and I was putting it off because it seemed like a significant thing to do, and then I woke up last Tuesday and it did not seem significant at all. It seemed like the obvious thing. Sometimes decisions get that way," Letitia said. "Has that happened to you?" Letitia thought about the advertisement in the paper, about sitting in the boarding house in November with $11 and a dress shop that had closed, about getting on the train. "Yes," she said, "more than once." She and Albert had been married for a year and a half now, which was not long in the way that years are counted, but felt very long in the sense of knowing a person, because they had been at close quarters through all the seasons, and through sickness and difficulty and ordinary happiness, and they knew each other properly now. She knew the sound of his breathing in the dark, and the way he moved when he was thinking hard about something, which involved a kind of stillness, and she knew the particular set of his shoulders when he was pleased, which was different from his resting posture in a subtle way that she had learned to read from across a field. He knew when she was tired before she said so, and he knew when she wanted quiet, and he knew her taste in books well enough to have ordered one from Wichita as a surprise that was so exactly right that she had looked at him when she opened it with an expression she was told later, by Clara McRee, who had heard it from Holt McRee, who had heard it from Albert, was the best expression he had ever caused. Fall again, their second fall, and James was walking now in the determined lurching way of very young children, grabbing at fence posts and barn cats, and the long dried stems of the sweet peas along the fence. Albert had built the trellis in June, and the sweet peas had climbed it enthusiastically, and the front of the house had been fragrant with them all summer, and now they were dry and seeded, and she was collecting the seeds carefully to plant again next year. She added the dried sweet peas to the windowsill alongside the pressed wildflowers from the year before. The sill was getting full of history. She liked that. She stood at the window and looked at the row of dried flowers, and thought that a year ago she had arrived on a train in a gray wool dress with her heart armored against disappointment, and had found a man who had put flowers out for her before she came, and that she had been so unprepared for kindness that it had taken her until August to say she loved him, but that she had been saying it in a dozen ways every day since. She heard Albert come in behind her, and she did not turn around. "I've been thinking about the East Field," he said, which was his way of starting a conversation about the farm's expansion, something they had been discussing for weeks. "You want to put winter wheat in," she said. "If we can get the seed in before the first frost," he said, "it would mean a cash crop next summer." She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his coat still on and James on his hip, because James had a habit of ambushing his father at the door, and Albert had equally habitual given in to this ambush every single time. "Let's do it," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the afternoon light, this man, her husband, with their son on his hip and the farm around them and the wildflowers on the windowsill behind her. "You are considerably easier to talk to about farm decisions than anyone I have ever known," he said. "I suspect that's because I know what I think," she said. "You always know what you think," he said. "It is one of the best things about you." They got the winter wheat in before the frost, and it came up the following spring in a long green promise that made Albert stand at the edge of the east field with his hands on the fence and look at it with the expression he had when he was containing something. She stood next to him at the fence. "First cash crop," she said. "First of several," he said. He put his arm around her at the fence line, and she leaned into his side, and the spring sun was warm and the wheat was green, and the sweet peas were coming back along the front fence, and James was in the house with Dora Finch, who had taken to coming on Saturdays to watch him while they worked. An arrangement that served everyone because Dora had discovered she was very fond of children, which was useful in a school teacher. And James had discovered that Dora would read to him for much longer stretches than anyone else. By the spring of 1880, the farm had 12 cattle again, and then 16. The winter wheat had been harvested and sold at a price that put them in a genuinely secure position for the first time. And the house had been expanded again. Not just the east room for James, but a proper parlor off the front that made the house feel like a home that had settled into itself. Albert built bookshelves in the parlor, and she filled them in stages, ordering books from Wichita and occasionally from Chicago when she saw something she wanted. And the parlor became in the evenings the place where they did their reading and their talking, and where the lamp burned warmly while the dark moved around outside. She was carrying their second child by the summer of 1880, less surprised this time and no less glad, and when she told Albert he was out of his chair within seconds again, which she found she loved about him even the second time. "A brother or sister for James," she said. "He'll have opinions about which one," Albert said. "He has opinions about everything," she said. "He learned that from his mother," Albert said, and she threw a dish towel at him. Dora Finch had, by the fall of 1880, developed a friendship with a young man named Samuel Whitmore, who had come to the county to take a position as deputy under Sheriff Platt, and who was 24 and steady, and had a way of listening to Dora's opinions about frontier education with the focused attention of a man who found those opinions genuinely interesting. Letitia watched this develop over several Sunday dinners at which both Dora and Samuel were present, because she had started hosting Sunday dinners that tended to include Dora and Cyrus and Agnes, and sometimes Clara and Holt McRee, and which had become a small standing institution in their corner of the county. At one of these dinners in October, Samuel asked Dora a question about the school curriculum with such apparent genuine interest that Dora's usual careful composure became completely unguarded as she answered, and she talked for 20 minutes without stopping, while Samuel listened with his chin in his hand, and the expression of a man who could have listened for another 20 without complaint. Letitia looked at Albert across the dinner table, and Albert looked at her, and they both looked back at their plates. "They'll figure it out," Albert said quietly that evening after everyone had gone. "They've already figured it out," she said. "They just haven't said it yet." "Like someone else I know," he said. "I said it," she said. "I said it in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning." "I'm still glad you said it," he said. She was. She was glad every day. She was glad in the specific, textured, daily way of a person who has built a life with another person and finds the life good. She was not glad in some abstract or distant way. She was glad when she woke up and the prairie light was coming through the bedroom window, and he was already up, and she could hear him in the kitchen. She was glad when James came running across the yard to where they were both working in the garden and launched himself at Albert with total confidence that he would be caught. She was glad when they sat in the parlor in the evenings with the lamps burning, and he read something interesting to her, and they argued about it with the pleasure of two people who like arguing with each other. The second child was born in February of 1881, which was a harder time to have a baby than April, but not impossible, and Dr. Varner came out in a cold that was formidable and did his work with his usual capable efficiency. And this time it was a daughter, small and red-faced and fierce, who had, as Albert pointed out when he held her for the first time, the exact expression that Letitia had worn on the train platform when she arrived in Harlan Creek, which was the expression of someone who had arrived in a situation they were prepared to manage. They named her Catherine for Albert's mother, Catherine Mee Hawkins. She was a good baby, and then a very opinionated toddler, and then an extraordinarily determined small child, and she was, from the earliest age, entirely her mother's daughter in personality, which Albert remarked on approximately once a week with an affection that he did not disguise. The farm in 1881 was a different proposition from the farm of 1878. 16 cattle, the winter wheat rotation established, the kitchen garden producing at a level that left them with surplus to sell at the Harlan Creek market, the flower garden in full, magnificent summer production. Albert had taken on a young hand named Eli, a 17-year-old whose family had come west and not found what they were looking for and who had stayed in the county when the family moved on, and who was a willing and capable worker that Albert took a genuine interest in. "He reminds you of yourself when you came out here," Letitia said one evening. "A little," Albert said. "He's more willing to ask questions than I was." "Is that a good quality?" "It's a better quality," Albert said. She had by now been in Kansas for 3 years, and the woman who had sat on the train watching the planes roll past with her heart armored and her expectations set at the lowest possible level was someone she recognized, but did not entirely feel like anymore. She had become someone who knew the name of every wildflower on the property and the particular cadence of the prairie wind, and the way the light fell across the east field in the mornings. She had become someone who ran the Sunday dinners and kept the account books for the farm, and could tell you precisely how many jars were in the cellar, and when they were likely to run short and what needed ordering. She had become, in the best possible way, Letitia Hawkins, and the Bailey that had come before was still her, but was also the name of the woman who had gotten on the train in Cincinnati, and that woman had known nothing about what was waiting for her at the other end. She pressed flowers from the garden each fall now, a tradition that had become one of her favorite things, and the windowsill in the main room was thick with them, each year's flowers layered alongside the previous year's, a long row of color faded to brown and cream and pale gold. The very first ones, the ones Albert had placed there before she came, were in the center of the row, still there after 3 years, still the foundation of the collection. She told James about them when he was old enough to understand, kneeling beside him at the windowsill and showing him the ones that had come first. "Your father put these here before I arrived," she said. "Before he had ever seen me. He wanted me to feel welcome." James, who was 4 and who considered most information for a moment before determining its significance, said, "Why?" "Because he is a good man," she said. James considered this. "Papa is good," he confirmed, with the certainty of a 4-year-old who has no reason to doubt it. "Yes," she said, "he really is." She was at the kitchen window that evening when Albert came in from the barn, the particular swing of his walk across the yard that she knew as well as she knew anything. And she watched him come and felt the same thing she had felt the first time she really looked at him, that something was shifting in her that was not going to shift back. Only now 3 years and 2 children, and a full cellar later it was not a shift but a foundation. He came through the kitchen door and she had coffee on the table and he sat down and took the cup and looked at her across the kitchen and said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You're looking at me like something." "I'm looking at you like I love you," she said. He set the coffee cup down and reached across the table and took her hand. His hand was warm and calloused, the same as the first day, the hand that had helped her up onto the wagon on the platform in Harlan Creek on the day she arrived expecting nothing. "I love you too," he said. "I have been in love with you since the kitchen garden, but I was in love with the idea of you before that, before you even arrived. I had put the flowers out and I was hoping." "What were you hoping?" she said. "That you would be someone I could actually love," he said, "not just someone who would make the arrangement work." And was I? He looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light of a day in 1881 on a farm in western Kansas, with 2 children asleep in the east room, and a cellar full of winter stores and 16 cattle in the pasture and sweet pea seeds waiting in the envelope on the shelf for next spring. And he said, "You were so much more than that. You have been everything I hoped for, and things I didn't know to hope for." She held his hand and the morning light moved across the floor, and in the east room James stirred and began the process of waking up that would shortly involve calling for his breakfast. And Catherine, who was not quite walking yet but was practicing with great determination, would be pulling herself up on the side of her cradle. The life of the farm would begin its day. She would press more flowers this fall, she thought. She would add them to the windowsill alongside the others, another year laid down beside the years before it. She would add them to the row that started with the ones Albert had placed there before she came, before he knew her face, when he was hoping in the best and most careful way that a lonely man on a Kansas farm can hope, by putting something living in the window for whoever was coming. The spring of 1882 came in with a warmth that arrived early and stayed, and the wheat in the east field was up by April, and the kitchen garden was the most productive it had yet been. And Eli had taken on enough of the daily cattle work that Albert had time in the late afternoons to work on the thing he had been planning for a year, which was an additional room on the south side of the house, larger than the others, a proper sitting room with a proper fireplace. Because the parlor was full of books and the kitchen was where most of the living happened, and he wanted a room that was purely comfortable, purely for sitting and talking and reading and being at ease, a room that said the farm was secure and the family had enough and more than enough. He worked on it through April and May with Eli helping and Cyrus coming over on Saturdays. And when it was done in June and the fireplace was finished and the plastering dry, he built shelves along the south wall for more books and a window seat under the east window with a cushion that Letitia made from the blue calico he had brought her on that first trip to town, the bolt that he had set on the kitchen table without comment and gone back out to the barn. She had kept it all this time, and now she cut it and sewed it into the cushion for the window seat, the blue flowers on the pale background, and she brought it out and placed it in the new sitting room on the bench under the east window, and it was exactly right, the blue calico come home. "You kept it," Albert said when she brought it in. "I've been keeping it for the right occasion," she said. "I knew there would be one." He stood in the middle of the new sitting room and looked at it. His room, their room. This house that had started as 4 rooms and had become 6, and would probably become more because that was how things grew when they were cared for properly. "I came here 6 years ago with nothing much," he said, "and looked at this ground and thought if I stay long enough it might become something." "It became something," she said. "It became much more than I knew how to plan for," he said. the farm, and everything else. She stood in the doorway of the new sitting room in the June light, and looked at her husband in the room he had built, and thought about the train from Cincinnati, and the letter, and the platform, and the wildflowers on the windowsill, and about the kitchen garden, and the evening on the porch steps with the fireflies, and the Tuesday morning when she said "I love you," and about James in the East room, and Catherine, who was walking now and had opinions about everything, and about the window seat with the blue calico cushion. She had arrived expecting a rough and loveless life. She had found the opposite of that in every possible direction. "Albert," she said. "Yes," he said. "Come have coffee," she said. "James is going to want his lunch soon, and Catherine has already been into the flower bin once today, and I need you to tell her that is not acceptable because she does not listen to me about the flower bin." "She absolutely listens to you," he said, following her to the kitchen. "She absolutely does not," she said. "She listens to you the way you listen to your own practical arrangements," he said, "which is to say she hears you perfectly, and then does what she intended to do anyway." She turned around in the kitchen doorway and looked at him, and he was watching her with those warm brown eyes and the almost smile that had become in 3.5 years a full and genuine smile that reached everything. And she thought that love, real love, was not the thing she had read about in novels or heard described in the abstract. It was this. It was coffee in the morning, and the flower bin, and the window seat, and the wildflowers on the sill, and the man who had put them there before she came. "You are insufferably right sometimes," she said. "Only sometimes," he said. "Often," she said. "Frequently," he admitted. And she laughed, and he was laughing too. In the kitchen doorway of the house they had built together on the Kansas prairie. And outside the sweet peas were climbing the trellis, and the wheat was green in the east field, and James was calling for his lunch, and Catherine had gotten into the flower bin again. And all of it, every single piece of it, was exactly what she had never known to hope for, and exactly what she had come to love. She would press more flowers in the fall. She would add them to the row on the windowsill. She would keep them there for as long as there was a windowsill to keep them on. A record of a life that had begun when a careful and tender man put something living in a window for someone he had not yet met, and a woman got off a train in Kansas expecting nothing, and was given everything.